Good cause eviction sets limits on how much landlords can raise the rent. The measure also mandates that a landlord show good cause when evicting a tenant, even after the lease expires. And as you can imagine, this measure is very controversial.
So New York has now effectively banned landlords from raising rents, which might sound great to somebody who pays rent, but critics say no rent increases means nobody's gonna move. And with New York City already in a housing crisis, this could make the available supply of apartments even smaller.
For the first time in more than 50 years, New York City is facing a major housing crunch. The city's vacancy rate has dropped to 1.4%.
I got to get out so that he could bring a new family in and get more money.
I got the new lease, saw that it was being raised $230, and I mean, what do you say to that? Like, what do you do?
Legislators say the law would have disastrous consequences because it would be difficult to evict disruptive, destructive tenants even after their lease expires.
Average wages in the city increased about 1.2% last year. The median rent soared by about 8.6%.
Good cause eviction is not going to inspire new building,
leading to not only fewer rental units and higher prices, but also fewer jobs and a weakened New York.
Here's the reality. When the demand outpaces the supply of housing, all renters lose.
New York has now decided it's going to control the rents for every occupied apartment in the city. But although this might sound great if you're renting something now, what nobody's talking about is that it just got way more expensive to change apartments. Because the dirty little secret of this law is it's going to get so expensive to move, people are going to stay put as long as possible to avoid a rent increase. Which means this law could totally backfire on future renters who can't find any available affordable apartments, and also on current renters who find themselves trapped in horribly tiny box apartments they rented at prices they could afford. And they're essentially prisoners now. Because New York's in the middle of a housing crisis, demand for apartments is through the roof. And if you reduce the supply of available apartments by keeping people in them longer, there's just gonna be more competition for the few places that are left. And since a landlord's only opportunity to get more rent is to do it when the apartment's empty, anything that's available is gonna have a price that is so high your eyes are gonna pop out of your head. Because although our altruistic leaders think they're doing renters a favor by capping rents, there's no such cap on the property taxes a landlord pays, or the utilities like heat and gas. But the real reason this law is going to make things more expensive for everybody is because it couldn't have come at a worse time. We're entering the busy season for apartment rentals. Last year, rents hit all-time highs. This year, that's going to happen again, pricing out native New Yorkers and transplants alike who can barely afford the rents they have now, let alone compete with incoming renters for an upgrade, which is going to force people to leave New York City. On top of that, there are some sneaky ways landlords are going to try to get around this ban on rent caps that nobody who wrote this law ever even thought of. So here we are, 2-bedroom, 1-bath apartment, $4,300 a month, right in the center of Lower Manhattan. And although this is one of the most affordable apartments in town right now, because of these new rules, this is the last time something that looks like this is ever gonna be this cheap.
Really passionate. Oh, there is no doubt about that, Brett. Good cause eviction sets limits on how much landlords can raise the rent. The measure also mandates that a landlord show good cause when evicting a tenant, even after the lease expires. And as you can imagine, this measure...
So this has passed, it is the law now, and it applies to every single apartment in New York City, not just the old regulated apartments, but free market apartments like this one with a minor twist. Regulated units typically get a rent increase of about 3% per year, which is set by the local government. And this law does something very sneaky to free market apartments like this one, but in a totally different way. Instead of capping rent increases at a number like 3%, the landlord can raise the rent to whatever he wants. The only difference now is that the tenant has the right to challenge that increase in court, and they don't have to move while they're doing that. The only catch is the increase has to be above 10%, which means there's gonna be a lot of people this year getting 9% increases on their next apartment. And it's important to understand, this has the potential to reshape the whole housing market here in ways nobody's gonna be happy with, even if you rent this place at the current price and get locked in with low rent increases. But before we get to what those might be, you've got to understand this law is highly controversial because if you rent now, it looks like it's going to be the best thing ever, and if you own a place now like this, it looks like it's going to be the worst thing ever. So which is it? Because right now you've got renters saying they can't afford the current rents on apartments, which are incredibly expensive in this city as it is. Yet landlords have their own costs for maintaining apartments, maintaining buildings. They've got to pay for utilities, and those costs, many say, are unaffordable at the current levels of rent they're gonna be able to collect. So this could actually bankrupt landlords.
I gotta get out so that he can bring a new family in and get more money. Because if you see the brackets on what rents go for, this house he could put up for a lot more money than what I can afford.
Yalitza gets Section 8, which must approve an increase in rent. Her landlord wants her out by the end of the month. By phone, he told me it's not.
So definitely in this video, that particular renter, this law is gonna help her because she's got nowhere else to go if her rent goes up. And apparently her landlord thinks it's got a higher value than what she pays, so he wants to try and make good on his investment, which means he wants her to move out so that he can get a new tenant in who pays more money. And the landlord on the news says that she is a difficult tenant. That could be true, but she seems reasonable to me. Seems like a good tenant. But although this law really might benefit somebody who's on a fixed income and doesn't really have the ability to upgrade to another type of apartment and might have to leave if the rent goes up, as great as it might sound for a renter, it's equally bad for landlords, and that could screw up everything and end up hurting renters in the long run.
Legislators say the law would have disastrous consequences because it would be difficult to evict disruptive, destructive tenants even after their lease expires.
So as you can see, it is not a perfect piece of legislation to everybody, but the first major drawback to this is that if somebody challenges a rent increase in housing court, they can stay in the apartment while that plays out, which means someone could become a squatter. And the other problem with this law is that the more people who learn about it and start challenging their rent increases in court, the more backed up the courts are gonna get. We're gonna be looking at years before any of this stuff gets resolved. And this is gonna have unintended consequences because it's gonna change landlord behavior. Because now it's basically impossible for landlords to get rid of a tenant who's a problem for the building. And that's a problem because in this building, the neighboring units right here, what happens if this person leaves garbage and stuff out in the hall and then roaches gather here and crawl into my apartment? If I complain to the landlord, he's not gonna be able to get rid of this person by raising their rent or just deciding not to renew their lease. And in a city like New York, that's full of weirdos, you could be living next to anybody. In the past, any landlord with a problem renter could just say they don't want to renew the lease. And this incentivized tenants to respect the property and get along with their neighbors and not cause problems in the building for other people, because if other people complain about you, your landlord could say, you know what, you're not worth it, you've got to go, but not anymore. Now, you might be thinking to yourself that this law is called good cause eviction. And if a landlord has a good reason to get rid of somebody, they should be able to do it. But the problem with that is you got to prove it to the satisfaction of a progressive judge who probably doesn't like landlords too much. And we've got evidence this will be how things work based on how housing court works now. For example, in today's housing court, if a renter squats, doesn't pay rent for 6 months, and then gets kicked out, landlords never get the back rent as damages. They just get possession of their own apartment again after earning nothing from it. And possibly having to do extensive renovations because the squatter destroyed the place. But the next way this new law is gonna jack up prices for just about everybody is even worse.
Eviction is not going to inspire new building, right? It's not.
Leading to not only fewer rental units and higher prices, but also fewer jobs and a weakened New York.
And we all know.
Okay, those are some serious consequences right there. And the first one makes sense. If you make it harder to be a landlord, you're gonna have less landlords. Simple as that. Which will end up meaning less housing, higher prices. And that means this new law directly conflicts with the city's plan to build 500,000 new homes over the next 10 years. It's just not gonna happen if we disincentivize building apartments or owning apartments. On top of that, the 500,000 apartment mark, that's just to keep pace with current housing demand and population growth, which means best case scenario, the city accomplishes that goal and everything remains just as unaffordable today. Prices aren't gonna change if the city hits this goal. To really lower rents, they need like 1 million new apartments, which ain't gonna happen. And with this law essentially demotivating people from getting into real estate in the first place, the idea of New York City building its way out of this housing crisis is just a fairy tale that's never gonna happen. But what I didn't consider is how businesses are going to be affected by jacked up rents. Because companies have to pay people enough money to live somewhere and survive. And if rent costs go up, that increases the cost of doing business in this city, in this state. Because now you got to pay people more money so that they can get a place that's this big. Definitely an idea people are going to end up fighting against in court. And when you think of how expensive it already is to live in New York City, how groceries are through the roof, how when you go to try to buy any piece of clothing or even toothpaste, it's locked up, and now the store has to pay an attendant to come and open that case up and get you your item because shoplifting is also jacking up prices faster than inflation. It should be pretty obvious that rent inflation is really the last thing that we need right now. But that's exactly what we're gonna end up with. Companies can go remote if they need to. They can have somebody who's maybe living in a state like Connecticut and can travel into New York if they need to once or twice a month. They can pay that person way less. And what that could mean is jobs and employers start leaving the city before renters figure out that they're trapped in apartments and can't afford to upgrade. But believe it or not, landlords already have a few ways that they're gonna sneakily be able to avoid these rent caps, and these new tactics are definitely gonna hurt some feelings.
This here is what an apartment can look like when a tenant moves out of a rent-stabilized apartment after living here for nearly 30 years. This apartment went for $775 per month. For a full year, it sat vacant because the landlord says it needs $50,000 worth of renovations just to bring it up to code.
So here we have an affordable apartment that's vacant because it can't be fixed up in a way that the landlord considers to be profitable and a good investment. This place is twice the size of the one we were just in down the hall, and it's only $100 more a month, but the renovations are gonna stay the way that it is because it's so big, it would be super expensive. But at least here the owner has the option of doing something. If this were a stabilized apartment, it would be frozen in time like this forever. Because with a lot of stabilized apartments, you can't raise their rent, which means you'll never get back the money you put into fixing something up. This particular place, this is gonna rent the way that it is. Maybe the price changes a little bit, maybe the tenant negotiates with the landlord, but a stabilized apartment that is like maybe $400, $500 a month, if it really looks bad, that apartment's gonna disappear from the market forever, decreasing housing supply at a time when we need it. In fact, it's estimated that there are 20,000 stabilized apartments all over the city that no one will fix up and that nobody's ever gonna live in, which is essentially half the number of apartments we need to build every single year for that 500,000 plan over 10 years. And that makes it sound like New York City could solve its housing problems if it wanted to, yet it doesn't for some reason.
Since 2019, many such renovations have been unaffordable for landlords because of a New York law that caps rent-stabilized increases at 3% in order to tackle housing affordability in the city.
You know, it's crazy how much money people are losing just because they're not allowed to take something that they bought and then improve it as they see fit in order to make money and run their business. And now with this new rent law capping every single rent increase, landlords are going to resist. Let's say this is your place and you get 20% or 15% every single year. Well, now that this law caps that at 10%, your starting rent at year one is gonna have to be jacked up so that over the next 5 years, this place makes as much money as you had projected. And you'll probably get away with it because supply is now artificially depressed. But jacked up starting rents aren't the only trick landlords have up their sleeves. There's another way they can rent the apartment at a higher price, which doesn't reflect itself. And the way that's gonna work is when landlords rent a place, they're gonna charge a really high rent. Like let's say $6,000 a month. But if they only wanna get around $4,000 a month, you could rent an apartment like this, but only collect $6,000 of rent for 8 months. You could give away 4 months of free rent, which would mean the place is $48,000 for the year, and every single month you're collecting an effective $4,000. And believe it or not, landlords are already doing stuff like this. Look at this apartment right here. It's a $3,600 gross rent, but it nets out to about $32 because you get a month and a half free. And what that means is whoever lives in a place like this for the first year, they're gonna pay about $3,200 over the 12 months because that's the net rent. But when it comes time to renew, if you're a bad tenant, you're gonna have to renew at a price that is increased on that $3,600 amount. And since there's no law against against giving somebody a free month or 2 or 3 or 4 of rent, we're probably headed in a direction where every single apartment has an unaffordable rent and you get free rent to stay, and if you're good, you get free rent to renew. That way there can be a legal rent increase, which is below the amount required to trigger a court case, and tenants that landlords don't want will have to move out. But there's actually another component to all this madness nobody's talking about.
As a result, property values have plummeted 60 to 70% over the last 5 years, a degradation that is now trickling down to the property lenders, New York Community Bancorp being the poster child of this phenomenon.
Huh, so this could be bad for the banks. Let me ask you a question. When in recent modern American history have banks ever been the losers for any reason? Never, that's when. And if you think banks are gonna sit idly by while their mortgagees foreclose on all these buildings, there's probably another angle to this that none of us are seeing right now. I don't think there's any way they're gonna take that. And that's because big money doesn't lose money. That's not how they work. But this dumpster fire probably won't start for a couple of years. There's gonna need to be financial pain. Landlords are gonna have to start neglecting their properties, letting them fall apart while people are living inside of them, while at the same time failing to make their mortgage payments. Once that happens, and once banks realize that they're not only losing money because the owner of this building isn't paying their mortgage, the building itself has no value now because it's an absolute train wreck, something's gonna be done. And the most likely outcome will be banks pressure their willing political allies to get them to change laws, or at least to allow higher rent increases, which means the capped amount might go from 10% to 15 or 20%. And what this means is people are gonna end up getting priced out of New York City no matter what happens. The writing is on the wall. Landlords are already losing so much money because of their worthless vacant storefronts nobody wants to try and run a business out of, and those 20,000 affordable apartments that have disappeared because they'll never be renovated. And this unfortunately means New York City is about to learn the hard way that landlords aren't the ATM they thought they were. Many people think the real solution to this mess is going to be to modify the laws so that we don't have to have old buildings like this and like these little guys over here just sitting around taking up space, when we could have taller, newer buildings that more people could live in instead. But no, current laws dictate that these buildings are as big and as tall and as wide as they're ever going to be, which means it's essentially impossible for New York City to build its way out of this mess. All the while, our genius leaders come up with little laws to rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic while we all get priced out. Should New York modify its laws to make it easier for people to build buildings? Why does it make sense for there to be a vacant lot in the middle of Manhattan? And how do you think landlords are going to get around these new rent rules? Should they try to get around them? Should they just play ball and give these places away even though their taxes and their utilities go up? Let me know what you think. How would you fix New York's housing crisis? I'll see you in the next video.